So here's where I decided that these feet were not good enough, and I fix up the positioning of the feet. I make it nice and flat on the ground so that they're not going underneath the ground when we animate these eventually. I'm just repositioning, making sure that the blocks aren't clipping into each other. Just really trying my hardest to make this foot look better than the first draft. Here I am adding a bevel to give the foot more shape, and then that second block was there to help with the clipping of the lower leg. And then I think this is where I copy I push the leg out for the other side, the other leg. I do fix these later because I forgot the claws. Next up here is the loincloth. Man's needs to be decent. This is when you're making a character with big muscles, you don't put them in clothes, you put them in a rag that barely covers anything. So I'm making it look nice and clean. I was trying to get the loincloth to not be so blocky, so I'm giving it shape by rotating 2 pieces on the ends, putting them nice and snug, trying at least. I don't think I managed to get that outcome, but it looks good enough, and good enough is good enough. I think I start working on the straps immediately here. Yeah, so I'm just making the strap and just boopity boopy da bop ba. Yep. Put it on the back. Definitely. This part here was kind of irritating for me since I needed to get this at a 90-degree angle. And then a lot of fidgeting with this loincloth because of how the Mitachurl, I'm just calling Fred, how Fred was positioned. Its torso was rotated. Here I'm adding some fun detail where it looks like the cloth is like peeking out the edge of the belt. I really liked this little touch here, and I'm actually pretty proud. I'm pretty proud. And I think Fred enjoys being a little bit more detailed. I really enjoy detail in little guys like this, and yeah. So this is where I was like, the loincloth is together, so I fidget a lot with this thing, and I bump up the blocks a bit, and then I start working on the back side. As much as I would have loved to have just copied and pasted the front of the loincloth to the back of the loincloth, I couldn't do that because in the reference I was using, this Fred has a longer back than in the front, so I just had to redo it. Here's the belt buckle for the belt. I just did a simple belt buckle, and then there was this little bird skulls on the on the belt. I had a lot of struggle with this one. I didn't really know how to make it, so I started off with a weird shape like this. I don't know what I was trying to do there. I immediately realized that it was just not going to work, so I went with a flatter shape, did a nice angle on it, and started rearranging the blocks to get that bird beak. I don't know what those skulls are. They might not be skulls, they might be bones. That's the same thing. They might be rocks. I start putting it on the belt, positioning it right, trying to make it look good. And I really, because in the reference there were 2 skulls, but I couldn't fit it without it clipping into the leg. And I had already fixed this leg like 3 or 4 times, so I really didn't want to do anything with it. So I just decided one inaccuracy is good enough. Oh, I'm beefing up the chest here because, dang, he looking fine. Here's where I realized I needed to put the claws on. So I started putting the claws on, and yep, you're seeing what I'm seeing. It's claw time. And then I have to remake the leg, and it's a whole process. Then I'm repositioning, making sure that the model is on the ground and not floating. And here's where I, again, fix the bush. Most of it is hair. I need to fix its bush. But it was really quick. I just resized some things, made it not clippy, made everything kind of fit. Here I'm adding a little bit more point to the beak because I just didn't think it was long enough. And I'm just saving my project, and I'm gonna cut this.
To begin with, I colour picked some colours from the Mitachurl splash art, I believe it is. It's the one with the Geo shield, and I just double checked some of the colours and tweaked a few of them, put them on the palette, and then created a little range from darker to lighter. This is how I personally like to make my colours, as I like to shade this way. Now, when it came into the model, I separated out and found whereabouts all the fluff in the head was, and I began to model the fluff. Now, this was maybe the biggest area in terms of fluff on a model I've ever had to do, and it was quite interesting to texture. I spent quite a long time doing this, honestly, and the aim was to make it look like matted fluff, so it looks a little bit cobblestoney, but yeah, the aim was to make it look like matted fluff around the mask and to show the general direction of all the fluff. This, to me, worked out quite nicely when everything was all together. It looks a little bit strange on its own at the beginning, but I spent a very long time doing this as there were so many layers, and there's a few times, as you saw there, that I had to just tweak a couple of the cubes because textures were intersecting, which is fine. It's an easy little fix, and I just fixed it very quickly. I started going through my different shades. Some of them were a little bit too harsh, so I manually picked while also in Blockin, which is what I'm using to texture. I kept flicking back and forth to the reference quite a lot. I think I may have missed some stuff out. I think there's a red line on the arm that I did end up missing out. But generally I tried my best to stick to the reference, so I constantly am tabbing in and out of Genshin to make sure that I've got all the colours right. So this continues on for quite a while. I did the fluff for a very, very long time. So yeah, as you can see here, I've only done a few of the squares, and anything that you couldn't see when they were all together, I didn't personally shade because it was work that was kind of wasted, so I either just put a flat colour, or if it was in the middle of just all of the fluff, I just didn't put a colour down. I found it easier, and yeah, I was working towards the back of the head here, and so I was trying to make it look slightly directional while also making it look quite scruffy and not so neat. And then from there I started working out to the sides to kind of try and create a more central to the mask texture. Like I say, this is my first time doing a texture on such a scale. I've only done little bits and bobs in the past on smaller models, and typically I change a lot of colours in larger areas. I've done a few things like that in the past. But in this case, I just kept going back, and you can actually see at the end of the model that where I began is not as good as where I ended up, as I learnt what was better for me. The main process to this texture is I make a couple of bubble circles and I connect them together, and then from there I add in some little bits of shading. I added a tiny bit of lighting in, and then I move on to the next piece and continue the same pattern of making a little bubble and connecting the bubbles all together so that it has a rounded but not directly looking like cobblestone type of look. So I believe here I'm doing the back of the head, or I'm doing the bottom of the head. I believe this may be the back of the head. So once again, I've just redid that there because it wasn't travelling down the head properly. I wasn't very happy with it. And it's okay to redo textures, so there's a few times I redo a few things. I actually make a really big error of I continue the fluff down into the body where the fluff is not meant to be. So you can see there again, I have just reset one because I didn't like how it was going out. It was too rhythmic. I wanted it to be more random, less circular, more little random shapes everywhere. Making it look like a controlled noise type environment. I found this personally worked out quite nicely for me. So here I'm going again with the bubble. You can see here there's all sorts of different shapes, but there are also the quite obvious circles. I believe this is the underside here, so I was a little bit more messy with it as it would have been hidden against the torso. There was a bit more adjustment there as some of the textures once again were just intersecting a little bit weirdly. And yeah, took a very long pause there. This is where I make a mistake. I completely forgot that the Mitachurl is not fluffy all the way down. This is why I stress that using your references is a very good idea. I wasted about an hour doing this bit here before I realised I made a mistake and this was the completely wrong texture. So check your references. Yeah, when on its own it does look a little bit cobblestone-like, but it's okay. It looks better when everything is all together and not everything is quite noisy, so that you kind of know that it is noisy for a reason. It is supposed to look... It's like matted fluff. It's like, I can't think of what the fabric's called now. It's like a type of fabric that's all bundled together. That's kind of how I envision the hair. So I just keep working away at it. You can see a lot of the undersides I just do very minimal shading into it. They're in places that you can't really see, so I kept it simpler just to save some time. I still haven't realised my mistake yet. I'm still doing all of this, which I find surprising. I kept actually checking back in on the reference. I just completely misunderstood where I was at, as I only opened the next file rather than opening all of the files. You'll see when I see my mistake. But I think it looks pretty good. I think what I had was looking pretty good, and again, like, I was just working on some things, making sure that the texture never got peeked out. Realised I forgot the ears on the head, so went back up to them really quickly and made sure just to do a little gradient on them, so I used the colours that I picked at the beginning. Realised some were a little bit harsh, and so I manually adjusted a couple of the colours in Blockin itself, just to make that tonal gradient a little bit better. Here's where I've realised my mistake, that this was not fluff, this was in fact the muscly part of the Mitachurl. Now, I don't typically do muscles, they're not my type of thing, but I gave it a really good shot here and I think I did pretty well. So at the moment I'm just doing the upper part of his torso, just making sure that it looks correct all the way around. He looks a little bit like a hedgehog here, honestly, it's kind of funny. But just making sure that I define the kind of body from all different angles. So I keep kind of looking at it and deciding, have I done it right, have I not? Keep flicking back to the reference now because I realised that I didn't get it in the first place. And then I start using the grid to mimic both of the sides together, as I wanted this bit to be symmetrical, but not the full thing. I just liked a little bit of it symmetrical so that the ribs on both sides were the same. This was actually when I realised that Mitachurls only have 3 ribs poking out of their sides, which was useful for me, but also interesting to know. I start adding in some lighter shades as well to get the back in. Now this part, there was a tiny bit of the hair that went down the back that wasn't in any of the squares, so I used the already made texture that I had already put on before and just shaded the skin around it. This was to make it more consistently flow together and add in the back muscles. I begin on the mask here, and I started just making sure that none of the squares interlined so that none of the textures were a bit weird. Then I started plotting out whereabouts I was putting all the patterns. Honestly, I just went for it here. I was eyeballing the reference, I kept going back and forth and just seeing how I could place things, making sure that I got everything. You see there I get into like the little inner ears, and yeah, just generally getting in the mask. This one I had a bit of an issue with. Some of the textures you can see here, they don't line up properly, and I couldn't fix it as the model was not using full numbers, which is okay. It just messes up a little bit when you get over to the texture side of things. So some things don't intersect properly, and I just generally did not have a good time with trying to work this out. I would have had to manually map the UV map, but with how far that I was in this already and how long I'd already taken for the fluff, I decided against doing that. So I started on the waistband here, so just making sure, I think it's called a waistband anyway, just making sure that I have everything correct, sized up correctly, kind of all nice and close to the reference with what I have. Just shading some stuff in. This one again was a little bit of a harder one to shade in just because of how small some of these little objects were, which is the Mitachurl generally, so just did some little basic shadings on them. Some basic shadings here, just generally working through, trying to figure out what exactly to do. Here I realised that the shading that I was going to do didn't work properly, and I just had to give it up. Another problem I had with the UV map is some of the things intersected a little bit, so it's like the foot there became part brown, so I moved them out of the way just so that they stopped changing colours. I then start defining the leg muscles because it would have looked weird if the legs were not defined muscly while the rest of him was. So I started working on how to make the squares a little bit more rounder without making them round. So just generally creating little like semicircles in it, shading them out, just going back and forth in shading and working out the shape, shading and working out the shape. I begin on the lower legs, and this one I don't do as much in terms of the shading due to the bandages, so there wasn't too much on the leg that I had to define. So you can see me doing the little bandages. I didn't want to make them too big, as the bandages on his leg aren't really too big, and started shading in the little knee and just generally making sure that each side's bandages looked kind of similar. Shaded them in. I think I forgot his knee there. Oh, that's the knee now. Yeah, added in the shading, added in lighter colour because I think I did that one in a darker colour on accident. So he's generally looking a lot better than, not generally looking a lot better, he's looking a lot better than at the start. He's looking, I mean he looked really good at the start anyway, but he's coming together, that's the wording. So yeah, just kind of going around, making sure to shade everything to make sure that it doesn't look too awkward. Kind of sculpting the foot with the shading. Realised I forgot a little bit on the belt. Added in the base of the foot, the nails, shaded them in. I think I went back and changed these. I don't know if I did that on here. I did do that on here. I then went and changed over to the arms, tried shading one of them in so that I could get the colours down and then could disable the leg. You see here, once again, I'm just sculpting the leg out. Now, because of the blocks, the way the blocks are done here, I don't have to sculpt the muscles in as much this time. So it is just generally rounding all of the cubes out a little bit. So I'm just going around and I'm just shading them just how I think that they would be shaded, kind of keeping everything to a invisible light source over on the top right, as that's how I particularly like to work. Started adding in a little bit of the fluff between his like gloves here, as I didn't actually know he had little like gloves. And his nails. Added in little bends of the fingers just so it looked a little bit better. And then mimicked but not properly mimicked the shading on one side to the other side, and just once again going around shading, defining and rounding out the squares a little bit, just to help them look a little bit more coherent with everything else. So there's a lot of sides on this guy, so I accidentally miscounted there, so I had to redo it. I did 4 down instead of 3, and once again started working on the little glove bit, the little like fluffy glove. I'm just going around making sure that I've coloured everything in. Here's more bends of the fingers, shaded in, kind of palm, the nails, the rounded bit at the top of the shoulders, and this is the Mitachurl when he is done.